So I want to, just as I kick this off, just an idea of what we are interested here in, and then we'll have a greeting from the mayor. And the reason that I asked all of you here was because for a long period of time now, there's been a great sense of frustration that we all feel in Washington about a topic that we all used to agree upon. And that was a regular investment in America's infrastructure: highways, bridges, airports, railroads, water and sewer, broadband. And even that has become stalled. So we're looking at a little bit of an opening here, because the initial offer, I think, will not be the final offer, but whether or not we can get there still is a substantial challenge for all of us. But if I could just use the opportunity to highlight a couple of things, a reminder that the building that we're in was largely financed by the federal government. So we understand that it is the ability of the federal government to do what is expected of them, and that is to do projects that have economic spin-off based upon that investment. Beginning in May, and again as part of the stimulus money, that at the time was pretty unpopular, but not only did I support it, I got up and spoke in support of it. The idea was, when you have an economic downturn, conventional economics always says you cut taxes and you raise spending. We did both. We did both. However, one of the challenges is that people didn't know one side of it, and that was the cut in payroll taxes. So beginning in May, with these 12 trains that are going to be coming up from New Haven through Hartford and on to Springfield, and we anticipate and hope north of Springfield as well, that's based upon the stimulus money that was used to improve the rail. And Governor Malloy deserves acknowledgement for the fact that he decided to do the investment. I was on that train north of Springfield with Governor Patrick, an initial run. That train hit 70 miles an hour in Hatfield. And I want to tell you, when I talked to Governor Baker, he's been really good to work with on this stuff, and he wants a big infrastructure initiative as well. I will say this, that I don't know what the formula is at the moment, but 80-20 is what Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, and Sam Rayburn agreed to. And it was one of the most superlative achievements in American history in terms of what they were able to do. The Berkshire Eagle today, or yesterday, they have a piece that is pretty significant about what's happened to bridges in Berkshire County, across Franklin County, what's happened in these smaller communities. I mean, part of, I think, our argument is we need to emphasize that Sturbridge exit. We've all seen what happens there on a Friday. Many of you are going to have your own initiatives. So I hope that this will be a chance to talk to DOT and at least start to frame in your own minds what your priorities would be, so that we can speak, whether it's in Central Mass or Western Mass, with one voice on these issues, determine our priorities. I've had a number of conversations with Jay Ash on this, and I've spoken to Governor Baker at least 5 times about this. And he met me in my office about 3 months ago. He was here on a Sunday, and he came by, and we just chatted about infrastructure. So I know we're all going to have our own priorities, and I think that we'll have a chance to shed some light on what those would be. And I also know that we're interested in the east-west rail side of it. That's for sure. And anything that we can do to, I think, upgrade our investments, that would be something we all agreed to. And my friend Stan Rosenberg is here. Good to see you, Stan. Nice to have you here. So, Mayor, if you would just give us a greeting, and then what I thought we would do is hear what you all have to say after we hear from DOT.
Thank you very much, Congressman Neal, and again, to all the representatives that are here, and Senator Rosenberg, Stan, it's good to see you. DOT officials, thank you very much for being here to try to put together a comprehensive plan that we can continue to work together. Obviously, with Union Station, what is immediate is a north-south. That is happening now in the Knowledge Corridor, and that's extremely important as we continue on the north-south rail. Through the efforts with Senator Lesser and Chairman Wagner and others, the study to look east-west is something that should be looked into, but we have something immediately on our plate right now with the north-south, and that'd be instrumental. I know this is based in Springfield, but it really does bring a regional hub for transit that can help all your communities, and I would think that we can work together as you try to connect your communities that you represent to. So really appreciate you being here. I know the Congressman appreciates it immensely, and I want to thank Kevin Kennedy with my staff, who's been an outstanding nuts and bolts guys in putting on the many, many projects we have going on here in the city of Springfield. Again, to DOT, we appreciate your continued belief and investment here. And the last thing with Congressman Neal, obviously well-respected in D.C., but he never forgets his home, Springfield in the 1st Congressional District. But the time could be right now that an infrastructure compromise can come about on the federal level that would benefit us all, not only in transit but economic development, but also jobs. And that's a good 4-letter word. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And what I thought, maybe Scott Bosworth and Astrid Glenn are here from the DOT, and they could kick it off, and then they could allow all of you to say what you'd like to say.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd just like to give a couple introductory remarks, and I'll turn it over to Astrid. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having us. We're happy to be here with our federal, state, local, and community partners, and we always have an open door to you all. We're here also with Dan Fielding. He's our area legislative director, and hopefully you all know him. So, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say I met the Congressman early 90s when I was in Washington as a young staffer on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I worked for a gentleman named Bud Schuster, who is known in the infrastructure world as a get-it-done guy. But I sit here next to a gentleman who I can honestly say, in all my years working with Massachusetts politics and government, no one has been more consistent on transportation and infrastructure matters. You know, hopefully Congressman Capuano doesn't hear that, but honestly, I mean that. And he has been very, very open and to working with us through, you know, various administrations, and I just wanted to thank him publicly. He's a voice for you all, for us all, and a prize. If I could just address for a moment the infrastructure package that's been talked about. We're lucky to have a delegation that knows infrastructure, knows the importance of it. But we need to be realistic, and realistic in the fact that we would love to see $1.5 trillion. Who wouldn't want to see $1.5 trillion of investment around this country? But in honesty, it took 10 years to do the transportation bill that we are living under today, which is called the FAST Act. It took 10 years to complete that package, and it is a good bill. And what we would hope for, what this administration would hope for, is that Congress fully funds the act that's there, because right now we're not getting the funds that were authorized. So we're hopeful that Congress will continue to fund that. And hopefully a package can come out. And we're hopeful. Infrastructure always has been a nonpartisan subject, and we're hoping it remains that way. But if it can't, and if Congress can find some money, Congress did a really smart thing in the FAST Act, and it built it so it could accept more money without going through the authorization process all over again. We say, hey, if you can find more money, come to the consensus to get that money on the street today so you all can go to your constituents and say, hey, we're able to get this project going. So while we're all, we're at the table like every other state for an infrastructure package, we would love to see something come out this year that we can actually put into the ground here in the Commonwealth and certainly in this region. So I again want to thank you. I look forward to listening to you, and as I said, we're always open to further conversation and ideas that you may have. So I'm going to turn it over to Astrid Glenn, our rail administrator. She may have some comments before she introduces some concepts of the rail plan.
Well, thank you all for being here and also being interested in the topic of rail. Just as a little background on the rail plan, it is federally required, but it is also something that we wanted to do to help guide our investment in the rolling 5-year capital investment program that we do every year. So we are the proud owners of about 300 miles of railroad in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we spend a great deal of our resources every year simply keeping that mileage in something resembling a state of good repair. But we want to do more than that if it is all possible. So what we included in the rail plan were some near-term actions, most of which are in the capital improvement plan, and some longer-term actions, which include things that we are hoping to get to and working towards. And I will leave with you today a handout with, some details on the plan. The handout, I will say, is focused only on this region. So please, there's some obvious things like South Coast Rail. that you will not see mentioned in the handout simply because it is focused on this region. The principles, though, of what we did in the rail plan was to look first at long-term reliability and having a system in good condition. That was our first goal. Our second goal was to try and modernize the system. Our third one was to try and optimize it, make the most of what we have. And our fourth was to achieve regional balance. For this region, there are a few projects and plans that I think are particularly of interest to the group here. One is the ongoing study that Senator Hines is involved in, actually sponsored, for the Berkshire Flyer. This is looking at whether and how we might be able to have service between New York City and Pittsfield akin to that which we've already created for summertime service between Boston and Hyannis called the Cape Flyer. So it's an ongoing study. It has a very energized working group involved in it, and I think it will be putting out its recommendations by March 1. We also have a second study, but this is a longer-term study. This study shows up as a Tier 2 project because in the long term, we broke out all of our work into Tier 1, things that could be implemented relatively simply is a term that I hesitate to use when it comes to a transportation project, but things that we knew how to implement. And then Tier 2, topics that were worth looking at, worth understanding, but we didn't know enough to say yes or no to right now. And then the third tier, of course, were things that we do not really plan to go forward with. The study that is in Tier 2 for this area, i.e. something we want to look at for the longer term, is the east-west service from Western Massachusetts to Boston. It is a study. It is not, at this point, well defined enough really to be called a project, but it is a study to see what would it take, what would it involve, what are the impacts, both positive and negative. What is the service that people are looking for? We've heard everything from high-speed rail to traditional MBTA-type rail to commuter rail to intercity rail. And the type of service is very important to defining the types of impacts and benefits that the project might have if it were to be developed. But in the meantime, there is, as the mayor said, and as the congressman said, a service that we expect to come online, we hope to come online very quickly. It is still being negotiated, the fine points, but we have been aggressively negotiating with Connecticut so that we can not only support the service that they are bringing to Springfield from New Haven, but also use that to leverage a pilot project that would go up to Greenfield. That is a service that we want to try. Linda Dunleavy from Franklin Regional Council of Governments, Tim Brennan from the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission have been great leaders in urging us to give this a try, and that's what we want to do. So what we're doing, consistent with our principle of maximizing what we have, we own the line north of Springfield. We bought that and have been rehabilitating that as part of the Knowledge Corridor project. So the Greenfield pilot would let us use that asset to see, can we improve the system so that people from Greenfield can get to New York City and back in one day conveniently, and also to the job sheds in Connecticut, and use that as a job resource. So those are the passenger projects. I do want to mention very briefly the freight projects, both because I love freight and because most of the lines we use are currently being used for freight. And as I said, that's where we spend a good deal of our time and money. Massachusetts has very few lines that are right now, freight lines that are now at the national standard of 286,000 tons, pounds. We have one that's at 315. Most, however, are 263. And particularly the one that goes through Palmer, New England Central Railroad, parallels the Knowledge Corridor, is only at 263. In Vermont, it's at 286. In Connecticut, it's at 286. And we have been trying to get some federal funds through the infra program. We've applied for it, and with some help from the railroad owner that has pledged a good deal of the total. And hopefully, we will be able to raise the weight on that line to 286. This is important because if we don't have the full weight available to us of the national standard, every box has to be light loaded. Every shipper, every receiver loses the economic benefit of a full load. So that's what we're trying to achieve. We'll see if we get lucky, but that is one of the principal goals we have set forward on the freight side. So with that, I will be quiet and let the congressman take over.
Why don't you just put your hand up or give me a thought that you want to be recognized here, and you're on. You can start to ask some questions perhaps about priorities. Yeah, Todd?
Sure. Yeah, Congressman, thank you very much for bringing us all together here. And thank you to all my colleagues. I think just from the perspective of the geography that we represent in the state, I think our challenges are quite different than our counterparts in other parts of the Commonwealth. I'm very happy to hear you make mention of the 286 weight issue, because that is a huge issue. And in the territory that I represent, particularly in Palmer, when they're letting out those loads in limited capacity because of the fact that they have those limitations, it does create an issue. So I hope that we can really focus on that. But Congressman, you had mentioned something really good at the beginning relative to the turnpike exits, and Sturbridge is one of those examples. Now, I know that we have this big chasm in western Massachusetts between the exit in Westfield and then that big kind of dark spot that goes further west. But I think we really need to take a serious look, a focus at the potential of future exits on the turnpike in Massachusetts. I think it's a huge issue. So, again, in the territory I represent, I've got Sturbridge and Palmer, but Sturbridge can be an absolute nightmare no matter what kind of reconfiguration we work on over time. So we eliminate the tolls, we change the lanes, we do some restructuring there, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really deal with the long-term problem. We got to feed a lot of cars in there. They take that exit, they use it as a cutoff, and as we see the benefit of living in the rural parts of this territory, people like to live in the small towns, and they commute to Worcester, they commute to Boston, they commute to Springfield. And so at the end of the day, when you got to get them home or you got to get them to work, those limitations are there. They don't have as many options. And the transportation infrastructure issue is huge because they can't hop on the train, they can't hop on the bus service. They don't have those options that people do in the heavily populated areas. So I think we need to take a serious look at just those feeder routes of exits on the Massachusetts Turnpike and take a real good look at those numbers. And I respect the fact that we've put language forward here in Massachusetts to study the potential of an exit in deeper western Massachusetts. I think we got to go beyond that. I think we really need to take a serious look at those numbers all over that stretch between central Massachusetts and western Massachusetts and see, what the opportunity is for the potential of future exits that can help these small communities out, because it's a barrier. Some of these small towns that don't have that major roadway in order to access those community territories, they struggle. And then ultimately, when business wants to come in or they want to look at the potential to develop old mills and old sites, they say, gosh, just to get my product to a major transportation highway, it takes me 15, 20, 30 minutes in order to get into that major infrastructure. And then it's like, I'm not going to even look at that town. I'm going to go 20 miles down the street. And so I think it's kind of that's a negative. And so I think that's something we really need to look at. And without monopolizing time, the East-West Rail obviously is a very legitimate issue for us. Palmer used to be the town of 7 railroads and major transportation infrastructure hub for rail. I think that's something that we obviously need to spend some serious time taking a look at. And I applaud all of the great work that you've done, Congressman. You've been a real champion on transportation issues, and we want to continue to work with you as a regional delegation. So I appreciate your time and hosting the forum today.
Thanks, Todd, very much. Who else want a chance to offer your thoughts or suggestions? Yeah, John? I was the city councilor when John was mayor.
Yeah, you were city councilor. I was your aide. You know, I come from North Adams. I come from northern Berkshire. That is the West to me. It's not Springfield, it's not Worcester, that's the West. And I say this directly at DOT. You know, the governor acquiesced basically when we finally got somebody from Berkshire County on the transportation planning for the next 20 years or so. But I think what has to be understood here is that my area, three of the 5 towns or cities included in Berkshire County have the largest shrinking population percentage-wise of any communities in the state of Massachusetts. We have the highest unemployment rate in many of those communities. You talk about not being able to. We had a modular home company 30 years ago that wanted to come to our county in the city of North Adams. They couldn't do it because the bridges weren't wide enough to move the modular homes out of there in sections. We're 45 to 50 minutes away from the Massachusetts Turnpike. Now we've got to fight like hell to become part of this connector line from Worcester to Springfield, and it's stopping there. I want to see that line go into Pittsfield. I want to see that line go into Berkshire County, because you want to know why? Look at the economy. This administration and all prior administrations don't seem to mesh in talking about this. And I'm angry about it to a certain degree. And I want to see something done, because I'm like a bad smell. I'm not going away. I got back into this game because I saw these things weren't being paid attention to. And I want to see something happen. We have the largest museum of contemporary art in the world, and yet we also have one of the largest unemployment rates, one of the poorest transportation systems in the county. That's Western Massachusetts. It took me an hour and 40 minutes to get here today. That's Western Massachusetts, not Springfield. But we're benefiting Springfield if we get that extension out there, because it's going to bring people from the west to the east, and we all benefit from it. And I've said this to Senator Lesser, and he agrees, and he's to a certain degree, I guess. But we have to do it, and we have to work as a region. But the area that I represent is dying, and we've got to do something about it. And I ask the DOT, and in turn, I can't say enough good things about the congressman. I made the nomination for him to become president of the Mass Mayors Association back in the 80s. You know, and he understands it, he gets it. I hope the bureaucrats get it, to put it very bluntly, because that's what we need. And I really mean this sincerely. And that's what it's all about for me. As you can tell, I'm not working on advancing my political career. What I'm doing is trying to advance the best interests of the community, the area that I represent.
Thanks, John. And the other part of it, he has been a terrific advocate, but high electricity costs as well in the state of Massachusetts. It's a huge issue, and it's an issue that's pronounced in Berkshire County. Very, very high energy costs. And trying to overcome some of the opposition to everything is a bit of a challenge for us as well. Who else? This is your chance to, Senator Welsh.
I could probably speak loud. I have a soft tone to my voice. Thank you, and thank you, Congressman, for putting this together. As always, looking out for the needs of Western Mass and the 4 western counties. First, in working with, and this is really to DOT, and they've been great to work with on some of the issues that we've been facing in some of our neighborhoods. There is one pressing issue, and we have worked with DOT on, and the mayor, of course, as well, and Representative Gonzalez, fixing the issue with the Harena School tunnel. And, you know, I know that previous administrators have made commitments, not, you know, very recently. I think it was last November, this past November. And I know that there's been some change in DOT and whatnot. But we just want to make sure that the local projects that are supposed to be, you know, being funded and being completed are being lived up to. And that's one example. Obviously, here in Western Mass, we have a couple rivers that run through here, so our bridges, although Chairman Wagner has done a great job with all the infrastructure needs in Chicopee, and we appreciate that. But you know, all the bridges obviously are in need of, in many cases, in need of repair, in need of upkeep. And then, you know, we're very proud and very pleased, and we can see it, kind of see it from here, the 91 corridor, which has been or is in the process of being completed, which is a great solution. But then some of our smaller roadways and routes, Route 5 in West Springfield is in continuous need of repair, and that's a very a big economic development corridor for West Springfield. Certainly Route 20, which goes all the way from, well, it goes all the way across the state, basically, but for our district, from Westfield all the way through Springfield, constant need of repair as well. And I just ask that you keep those smaller projects, those neighborhood projects in mind, especially when commitments are made, to make sure that we follow through on those. And but other than that, I appreciate Congressman especially for not only for bringing the money back and helping us fund these projects, but putting events and meetings like this together so we can all hear about other people's priorities as well, because it helps us as to think as a region. You know, in terms of adding, you know, additional exits, that might throw me off, because that's how I calculate how long it's going to take me to get to the State House as I pass a certain exit, 10 or 8, 9, 10, and whatnot. But that was just a joke. So, but nonetheless, I'll turn it over to some of my other colleagues. I know that there's other priorities that are in place.
Scott, would
I just
like
have
to
a
respond?
question.
Yeah.
I can't really respond, but what was the first one you mentioned? School tunnel?
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
I
it's-
didn't hear that. I didn't know, Dan, if you've heard of it.
Yeah, what is happening there, and thank you, Senator Welch and Representative Gonzalez. If, I'm glad that the senator brought that up. We have a school, Lorena School, that was built in the 70s. There has been a water situation. Everybody always thought it was emanating from the ground, foundation. Through Pat Sullivan, my Director of Facilities Management and Park Superintendent, it is coming from the top. And when work was done on 91, the membrane, there's a situation with the membrane. If that membrane situation is corrected on 91, we can continue to go to town on alleviating the issues of the tunnel. This is a tunnel that connects the north end, which was split in two during urban renewal back in the 70s. It is a lifeline to the residents of that area. I have 700 kids in that Lorena school. So as Senator Welch, and I appreciate Welch you bringing it up, a commitment was made that we would take, MassDOT would take care of that situation. And in turn, the city, my team, will go in, because what's happening is we're throwing good money at bad. You're doing temporary repairs, but yet the water keeps coming in. So we want to continue to work with you, but if that membrane situation can be resolved, that would be a home run in really helping out the Lorena School issue, which Senator Welch and Representative Gonzalez have been very helpful. That would take care of the whole issue of water coming into the school and into the tunnel area. I don't know if Rep. Gonzalez would like to say anything on that. Thank you.
Again, I think when I first came on board as a state representative, the main issue for the neighborhood was the Lorena School Tunnel, which is under the highway. And when I researched it, it was the same #1 issue for that community for over 20 years. And there was a commitment, there was meetings, there was emails back and forth, and again, just recently hearing that it hasn't been completed is disheartening to the community, but also as representatives, I think that we can just continue to advocate and work with you as best we can to make sure that that is the #1 project. And I believe that from the mayor's perspective, he has put that as his #1 projects for the city.
On the schools, yes.
On the school side. So that's great. So I hope that we can continue to work together, making that a reality sooner than later. And thank you again, Congressman Neal, for bringing all of us together, because I think as a legislator, I think it's important, because as I've learned from all my colleagues, learning about many of the issues, whether it's a exit in one of the central areas, or Mayor Rep Barrett in North Adams thinking that Springfield is not west enough for him. So it's great.
We're all 413ers.
We're all in 413, and that's great. So Congressman, thank you for your leadership in bringing us all together.
Who else?
All I can-
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry.
Aaron?
So,
Yeah.
all right.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Mayor. Well, as one of the newer communities in the Congressman District, again, I'll echo the thanks. And I know even before you represented Holyoke, you were a big supporter in what we did there, and you're no stranger to Holyoke for sure. I'll echo what my colleague said. Obviously, you know, when we talk about rail, I love it to go all the way out to Pittsfield, and the north-south rail is huge for us. One comment on rail, and then maybe just another comment that might be a little bit out of the purview. We talk a lot about bridges, and you don't think about Holyoke having a lot of bridges, but we actually do because of the canals. I know we're working with MassDOT. I just wish there was a way to sort of leverage those projects in a quicker sense, as you imagine. You know, we've got one that's kind of in the tip for maybe going out to bid this year. We've got another one on Appleton Street that maybe is 2 or 3 years out, and it just feels like if we could just get them all done and just be done with it, right? I know you say you agree, you know, and so I wish that we could leverage local, state, and federal funds to kind of get those projects just done in one swoop. And looking at those projects, I think it's also important for us to look at, and I don't know how much we consider, but the quality of life and the tourism impacts. I mean, economics and the jobs, I mean, obviously support 100%. But the quality of life and the tourism aspect, especially now we have a casino coming here, we've got the Basketball Hall of Fame, the Volleyball Hall of Fame, these growing restaurant industries in Holyoke, Springfield, West Springfield. Getting people around when they're here is critical. So if they're taking a train from Boston into Springfield, how are they going to get around? And so, again, this might be out of this purview a little bit, but I talk about PVTA in our local regional transit authority. We know they're having financial issues, and that's not necessarily the conversation per se, but I would love to see if there was federal ways from the federal government or this bond bill to look at investing in those electric buses. We have a couple online now in Western Mass. I think it's a signal to our quality of life out here in Western Mass. In the long run, they cost less in repairs. They cost more up front. Environmentally friendly might be a harder sell at the federal level right now, but hopefully, hopefully that can be something that we can leverage. But again, if there's ways for us, if there's federal programs that can help our RTAs as well, because once we get people here to Springfield, if they're visiting a casino or they're going to a Mass Mutual event, we want them to stay here and travel into this whole 413 region. So any of those kind of programs or leverages we can do more of would be great.
Hold, Scott, here you
I'd like
go.
to just address a couple things. First of all I can offer on the school is a commitment that we'll find out what the story is and get back to you guys, all of you, as soon as we possibly can. But Representative, when you mentioned the bridges, I want to talk about an initiative that we're working on right now on bridges. We've heard, particularly with the President's infrastructure package, a lot about public-private partnerships. And what I'd like to point out is that public-private partnerships perhaps are a really good tool to have, but they're a financing tool, not a funding tool, okay? But there are a lot of benefits to it. So we as an administration have been looking into delivering projects in that method. And one of those is a bridge bundle package for Western Massachusetts. And because we understand that a lot of the bigger bridges, they suck all of the resources out of a program, but they also take away, our staff time, our people. So the idea of doing a transaction where you work with a private sector partner that funds the project over a period of time and is responsible and takes all the risk for doing a bundle of projects. Pennsylvania has done this with hundreds. We probably won't go into the hundreds, but we would take a group of medium-sized to smaller bridges, put them in a package and hand it over to a private sector partner, and we would pay them back through availability payments, okay? We are not looking at tolling to do this. This would be out of our state federal funds that we get, and we'd have to program it in, and a certain payment would come to the private sector partner as the product is delivered to your constituents. As the product, the bridge, or whatever the infrastructure is, when that is handed over to the public for use, that's when we would begin payment. If for any reason that bridge or that facility doesn't meet the standards in a year that we required, they stop payment, they lose their payments. So it could be a very good tool for us, and one that we're very, very seriously looking at. The Western Mass Bridge Package was one of the 6 that we took out of our 270 original candidates. It was one of 6 that we are now researching heavily.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that. I wasn't going to inject the following into it, but I remember most of these issues as they've been described by John, and certainly the Harena School issue dates back to Frank Friedman's administration. And the idea was to connect two neighborhoods, but there's a rail bed on top, so that was part of the challenge. But the other part of it is, and I can say this because I know of Scott's goodwill, the Big Dig started as a $2 billion investment. It was $16 billion when it was completed, and when you add the $6 billion of interest to the principal, it was a $22 billion initiative. Now, look, it's the capital of the state. There's an airport. There's, a huge port of Boston. It is the center of a lot of economic activity for the Northeast. So, well, I mean, we're not starting from the argument about what should have or should not have been done, but there is a corresponding argument, I think, that on regional equity to this extent, that I met with at least 3 governors during that time, and with Republicans like Peter Blute and Jim McGovern, and Joe Worley and others to talk about what we thought was happening or what wasn't happening in central and western Massachusetts, because what really was happening, all of our initiatives were being put on hold. So you would do the design work, you would do everything you were supposed to, and then because of the continued increases in the cost of the Big Dig, everything moved from the planning stage to the planning stage. And I think that as you decide and you move forward, some of these small communities, I use the example of Savoy, and Adam would be familiar with that. I mean, the idea that the bridge out there now has barriers on it because it can only accommodate 1 lane of traffic should be something I think that we all feel is important to the western, again, in the central parts of the state. And I think the whole idea of regional equity here becomes really important parity for this part of the state. How about some other thoughts? I want to thank Joe Wagner because he was helpful in getting the equity. Is he? Okay. Who else? He always wants to be helpful. Yeah, Nick?
Congressman, thank you for having us here today. I think the showing that we have with all of my colleagues and yourself obviously proves the commitment we have to the region and transportation needs. And I'll be the first to say that obviously we always hear from our communities about needing the potholes to be paved and new sidewalks and the streets to be widened and bike trails. And I agree with all of that. But I think one of the areas that we might have an opportunity on is we both represent the city of Agawam. And I've been speaking with the new mayor over there, and I believe in the last 12 months, the stormwater testing qualifications on the federal level have changed. And speaking with him, I know that Agawam is facing about $2 million a year of overall expenses for these added testing initiatives. And I'll be the first to say, I want to protect the environment. I just put solar panels on my house this year. I'm committed to green communities, and I believe in all of that. But I do think we have an opportunity here with some of these new federal requirements and guidelines that have been put in place for a city like Agawam to now have a $2 million expenditure a year. And speaking with the mayor, I know that they're looking at new assessments on businesses, increased taxes on homeowners. And I think that maybe there's a different way that we can put together some guidelines or maybe change some things or create some new efficiencies to work with our cities and towns throughout not only Massachusetts but the country who are facing these new increased costs. And I was speaking with him just the other day, and I think there's 122 miles of storm drain in Agawam, a number, obviously, of other storm drains that need to be repaired, replaced, and fixed, and that's on top of the $2 million that they're looking at on an annual basis. So I do think there's some room for an opportunity to address those issues, maybe come up with a more efficient testing way or something to maybe bring down the cost on an annual basis for each one of our cities and towns. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Who else? John Sybeck?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for convening this. I think one of the things that MDOT has done that really has demonstrated its success, if we just look at the viaducts, is the program in terms of the incentives. And so here we got a project that's going to happen earlier, and there's going to be incentive. But I think the incentives need to go beyond the contractor. The incentives also need to look at the utilities. When Route 9 between Northampton and Amherst through the town of Hadley, through my district, was expanded, that project was delayed an entire season because the utilities wouldn't put their people out in the winter to remove the poles, remove the lines. And what wound up happening is the final paving didn't happen until the following year. We actually looked at the data and saw that the price of asphalt had increased. So the taxpayers paid considerably more because the utility did not want to put a few people out. So I think the incentives and penalty program should extend beyond a contractor, but also extend to the utilities who can clearly affect whether the project gets done on time or not. I appreciate my colleague from Holyoke raising the issue of the RTAs. I think that's an important issue for us. The reality is that the citizens who live out here do pay that same penny in the sales tax that the MBTA is the sole recipient of and the beneficiary of. And I think it's important that we not forget that there are RTAs and people who are providing public transportation beyond the scope of the MBTA that are being paid for by these individuals who receive absolutely no service. My third comment deals with the issue of disabilities and persons with disabilities, and we can't lose sight of it. And I think it happens across the state. Many of you realize that I have a staff person at the State House who is blind, and he utilizes the MBTA and utilizes the ride. Had 3 situations in the last 2 weeks that were just abhorrent. She has several times been refused to be picked up by Uber, who's contracted with the T, because she has a seeing eye dog. She had a situation where she's waiting outside the State House to be picked up and waited for an hour and a half for her pickup. She called and was accused of being rude. The day before she was picked up, and in actuality left the State House, was taken to Cambridge, to Somerville, and to Arlington before she was brought home. It was a 3-hour trip. And I think what I've learned from the Mass Commission for the Blind and other individuals is this is not an isolated situation. And I think we have people who are afraid to speak out, and I think it's absolutely essential, whatever we do at the macro level, we don't lose sight at the micro level of persons who are disadvantaged, persons with disabilities, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that they are not discriminated against and they have the same opportunities that you and I have in terms of getting from point A to point B.
Eric? Senator Lesser?
Well, first, thank you, Congressman, for convening this, and I want to thank MassDOT, who's been really great partners and great to work with on all the rail issues and a whole lot of other things. And I just want to echo, Representative Barrett's comments, because, I think part of the reason why people feel so strongly about rail is it really feels like a lifeline for us in Western Mass. Our communities are struggling. We're losing people. We're losing jobs. That's true in North Adams. It's true across our region. And rail, I really do think, is viewed as both a literal and physical and also emotional lifeline for our communities that are desperate for that connectivity. North-South rail is very exciting. One thing I'd point out, I think the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission did a study that showed that in our district, in my district, for example, I have 16,000 people, I believe, that work in Hartford every day. So the north-south link, and then of course into Greenfield as well, I have thousands of people that work in the 5 College area also, is so important. And continued focus and continued forward momentum on East-West Rail is essential. We need to keep that as both a medium and long-term goal. So I hope MassDOT continues their momentum on that. And on a little bit of a smaller scale, I want to thank both Congressman Neal publicly, as well as Senator Markey and Senator Warren, and I want to thank MassDOT for working on the Longmeadow rail crossing. People might not be familiar with this, but a Longmeadow DPW worker was killed during the blizzard last winter at the rail crossing, which had been unmarked in Longmeadow. The road is now closed, and we're working with Representative Ash as well, a really community-wide effort, and the Board of Selectmen to get the designation changed so that we can have a marked crossing there. It's actually in line with some long-term goals. There's federal money to create a new wildlife refuge in that area along the Connecticut River, so there's going to be a lot more people down there. So I just want to reiterate and both thank MassDOT for the work they've done, but also encourage us to all stay focused on this, because it's very, very important that crossing get marked.
We will be working on that also with some federal money, so we greatly appreciate that federal partnership.
Yeah. Senator Hines? Adam?
Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to add my appreciation for your convening this today. I'm going to pick up on your point on regional disparities, and I guess it's been a theme a couple of times today, and in part because when you look at the numbers in the Commonwealth, there are only 3 counties in the Commonwealth with experiencing population decline, and 2 of them are here in Western Mass, being Franklin and Berkshire County, the third one being the Cape. And when you look at the implications on those for not only our businesses, but our education funding and down the line, it's incredible. And we just watch this winner-take-all economy emerge towards Boston in particular. And so when we try to right the ship, we've been going all in on infrastructure for that reason. And I'm glad to hear that, and thank you, Astrid, for all of your work on the Berkshire Flyer, but also on north-south, and then the Knowledge Corridor in particular, and of course, east-west, that I'm glad the representative is emphasizing the need for that to continue across the entire Commonwealth. But the other piece I want to add to this is the internet and high-speed internet, and we've made considerable progress this year, thanks to several folks at the table, and Senator Rosenberg secured an additional $45 million just before Thanksgiving. And I think that we're at an interesting point where we're watching considerable progress, and yet we're going to see more need for investments in the make-ready process. So I don't want to take our eye off of that. And it's also creating an interesting dynamic of a small town of Mount Washington having higher internet speeds than downtown Pittsfield. And so there's an interesting disparity that's emerging that for startups and entrepreneurship, we also have to watch.
Yeah. And if I might, because I certainly want to acknowledge Stan's role and those of you in that effort, and also to understand that the middle mile was done with stimulus money. And, Governor Patrick deserves an acknowledgement for that. John Olver and I really lobbied for that, to use that money for the middle mile. And it highlights a pretty, I think, consequential economic argument that we frequently hear that can be easily addressed. If the private sector could have done that, they would have done it.
You mean if they chose to do it?
Well, that's part of it, but they chose to look at it and say, we can't afford it. So then the government had to use the money from stimulus for middle mile, and then debate how to find the last mile. And I think that was an example of something that could have been corrected. You want to follow up on that, Paul?
Oh, I would just say they certainly had the money to do it, they just chose not to do it because we're not profitable enough.
Yeah, that's it, not profitable.
And as the only legislator in the state who actually lives in one of these houses with no internet, with no TV, with no cable television, no cell phone service, and as someone who worked at Verizon for 10 years and watched them make $3 billion in profit every quarter, I know they had the money, but they chose not to do it because the people that live in our communities that we all represent aren't profitable enough to them quickly to make it worth their while. So thank you for fighting for that stimulus money, and to all of my colleagues here at the table for making sure we could supplement at the state level. And as I've been hearing for the last 10 years, it's 2 years away.
Yep, good argument. And I just have, I know that Representative Vilas is here as well, and I'm going to use the other example of what the stimulus money did in downtown Westfield. I mean, it was transformative when you come into the downtown area. And again, those were examples. And one of the problems we had was it was so controversial. And part of it was, once again, based upon the argument as opposed to the accomplishment. So the argument superseded the accomplishment, because by the time that all of the controversy died down, the projects were complete, and everybody said, oh, aren't they great? Who else? Anybody else? Steve, you had a long ride down here. You might want to.
Well, let me add my thanks, Congressman, for convening us. This is such a critical issue for our economies, social, educational, healthcare needs, and so on, getting around the region. So I'm pleased, Scott, what you had to say about considering a bridge package for Western Massachusetts. Most of the bridges in my district, 19 towns, are very small bridges, 20, 25 feet or under. And so the MassDOT initiative for a small bridge program has been very, very well received and oversubscribed. I don't know the exact number, but maybe there's $10 of applications for every dollar available, something like that. So if that could be expanded at the state level, these days a 20-foot bridge can easily cost $1 million, and in a small town of 1,000 people or 2,000 people, it's just beyond the ability of a town to pay for that themselves. So great program, and I would like to encourage you, Congressman, as you work on a federal infrastructure package, if there could be a small bridge component, particularly directed toward rural communities, towns under a certain threshold population of some kind, I think that would be money well spent in Western Mass, for sure, and I'm sure in many places around the country. And Astrid, thank you so much for your continued work on the Knowledge Corridor, the north-south connection. You said you're in some delicate negotiations at the moment, so you probably can't say too much more about it, but are we looking at potentially service in this current calendar year or soon thereafter? Can you say anything about that?
If we are lucky, that's our goal.
Okay. That sounds good.
So just the bridge bundle, yes,
Yeah.
you're correct. It is about 10 times oversubscribed. So if you all want to throw some money at it, that would be fine. But speaking of the rural, as we partner with the federal government, you're seeing Congress and the USDOT in particular, and the administration stressing the need for rural investment. I think the president's plan that's being floated around right now has 20% of the total amount that would need to be in rural communities. Now, I don't know about the details, but the prior administration, Newton was considered a rural community. So,
Really?
So just keep your eyes on the details,
Wow.
okay?
Struggling masses?
So, honestly, and in the discretionary programs like infra, for instance, there are set-asides in there as well. Astrid did mention one project, I was there, is Mass Central infra grant. Our second one, I'm sorry, New England Central, is our second request. We made two requests, is for a 495 I-90, 495 I-9 interchange. I know it's a little bit east, but I did want to mention that I imagine all of you have experienced some major traffic and safety concerns in that area, and we're committed to finding the resources to rebuild those two interchanges to make that throughput much safer, much quicker.
That's great. And while I have the mic, if I might mention one very parochial specific project in my district in Senator Rosenberg's that is the General Pierce Bridge, which connects the town of Greenfield and Montague. And Representative Mark represents Greenfield as well, so there are several of us in the room who have an interest in this. It is a critical bridge that gets a lot of commercial traffic as well as commuter traffic. I couldn't tell you exact traffic count, but we watch it slowly deteriorating because at least twice a month it usually has to be closed, some portion of it, half of it, one end of it, for emergency repairs. It's in District 2, and District 2 is very attentive to this, but it's over the Connecticut River. It's an expensive bridge. I forget the exact estimate, but it's in the vicinity of $20 million, approximately 5 times the annual tip allotment for Franklin County, and I think it's 3 or 4 years away. But some of us are concerned that it may not get to 3 or 4 years in its current state, and the constant sort of little patches that have to be made. And if that bridge ever got to the point of having to be closed before it's repaired, then it's an incredible negative economic impact on the region. So maybe you've heard about it. If not, I bring your attention to it and hope that whatever resources need to come to bear for the General Pierce Bridge between Greenfield and Montague, that you pay some attention to that. Thanks.
Is General Pierce an upstanding citizen?
I don't know who he was, but he got a bridge named after him, so he must be a pretty important guy.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Stan Rosenberg?
I'll have to do some research on who General Pierce was. That's good. So again, thank you, Congressman, for convening us and also for your extraordinary leadership. You remind me of Bill Bulger, who, when he first ran, said, give a young man a chance, and from every election after that, experience counts. So there isn't a guy with more experience right now anywhere in the picture, so thank you for sticking it out and providing great leadership. And thank you, MassDOT, for the work that you folks have been doing with us on a number of fronts. To be just slightly parochial, again, Paul, Mark, and I are connected around the Shell Bridge in Northfield, and you guys have been extremely creative in trying to help us figure out how to save that amazing structure. and add to tourism and to our connected bike system around Franklin County using that bridge. So I want to thank you very much for that. So I'll say ditto to, regional transportation. I hope we can get as much help as possible out of the federal government and also keep working at the state level to boost it, because the T gets quite a bit of money and the rest of us really have to struggle to get small increases to just add a little bit more service here and there. So I think one of the big agendas simply has to be to get more people into public transit, whether it's in a bus or on a train. We have to go back to the future. You used to be able to get to most anywhere you wanted to get on a train. Now we have to rebuild that whole system 100 years, 150 years later, because we got to get people off the roads for our environment, and we cannot build our way out of the transportation congestion problem that we have. And we even see it out here on Friday afternoons. You can't get there from here, where you used to be able to do a 10-minute ride from UMass to Northampton. It's 35, 40, 50 minutes. That's crazy. And that study that was done by Barry Bluestone over at the Dukakis Center that
Really good.
told us that on the expressway, right now it's 10.3 miles an hour or something like that. It's under 11 miles an hour for most of the day and night. And you can't grow an economy with that kind of a transportation system. So it leads me to two questions for our friends from MassDOT. The first is the governor has launched a administration-controlled planning process, and I know you have statutory authority to do that from time to time, and we certainly concur that that needs to be done. My question is, how will the legislature be involved? In many of the states where they're doing the most successful transportation planning, it's joint planning involving the legislature and the administration, the executive. And I'm trying to figure out how that new panel that's supposed to report by November is going to work with us. So that'd be my first question. And my second question is, once we know what our vision is and we put a price tag on it, we're going to hope to get as much money as we can from the federal government, but as has already been pointed out, that isn't going to be enough, and it isn't necessarily going to come as quickly as we need it. So if we're going to continue to maintain and advance our robust economy, we're going to have to do a lot on our own. And we were disappointed in the legislature, and I think it was a Senate initiative, but I will just say that the legislature, we were disappointed that the VMT pilot that we asked be done so that we could test it here in Massachusetts was rejected by the administration. We barely were able to get a nickel on the gas tax a number of years ago. We lost the software portion. We lost the inflation on the ballot. So can you give us some insight about the process you're going to use and whether the administration has some ideas at this point of a range of options they're willing to consider at the state level to help finance the development that we want in transportation so that we can keep our economy robust and growing. So those two questions, both related to planning. What's our role going to be in the legislature on putting the vision together, and what are the options for financing at the state level?
Mr. President, I'll trust me, I'm not deflecting. This commission is coming together now. As you know, they'll be sworn in this coming week. You'll be chaired by a friend of yours, the governor's former chief of staff, Steve Kadish. I can't speak to the public process, and particularly the process with the legislature, but I will tell you that, and I think you're proof positive of this, that this administration, not only respects, cherishes its relationship with the legislature, and I can't see a way this commission proceeds without interaction with not only the state legislative delegations, but the federal as well. I mean, if we're looking at comprehensively at the future of transportation in Massachusetts, we're all in on that. So I'm not deflecting, we don't know yet. We have to let Chairman Kadish kind of roll it out a little bit. Funding, I think, well, let's talk VMT if you would for a moment. Fundamentally, the decision on VMT, I think we're all seeing that perhaps is the future, okay? Frankly, I think it was a practical decision that let other states that are further along in the study of vehicle miles traveled, that are already doing studies, and that the New England, the I-95 Corridor Coalition that's doing the studies, let's piggyback on their efforts as opposed to trying our own efforts. I'm not going to speak to the governor's thoughts on it particularly, but DOT's was, other people are doing it. Let's watch them, let's help them, let's feed data, and see what comes out of it. But as far as future revenues, again, that's something that's going to be part of the discussion of the commission, part of the discussion of the legislature, and certainly part of our year-to-year capital investment plan. Our needs are not shrinking. We're spending more now than we ever have before. They're still not shrinking. We're very, our eyes are wide open that in the future we're going to have to look to be very creative, every tool in the toolbox. So I hope I somewhat answered your question, but I can promise you that you will be hearing more from the commission and the process for which the commission will engage with the public and particularly elected officials.
Great. If I could just follow up on that very briefly and say that we had actually hoped about a year ago that we would jointly do some work in this area. It didn't work. The Senate invited the House and the administration to work with the Bar Foundation jointly. So that didn't work out, but that's okay. So we did 9 regional meetings. About 1,000 people participated across the Commonwealth. So we want to offer what we've collected through our Commonwealth Conversations tour in the Senate. And I realize that they're just at the beginning of the process. So my question was actually a hope that you would invite us to the table.
Yeah, please. Senator Goby's office.
Senator Goby asked me to bring up a topic that has already come up briefly, which is the 80-20 formula of federal and state funding. She has heard a rumor that perhaps the current administration is not very favorably disposed toward that formula, and I'm sure you'd be happy to fight to keep it at 80-20, but I was just wondering if you had heard anything on that front, especially with the elusive infrastructure plan that...
I think the partnership has worked very well at 80-20, and I think everybody's heard about the kind of the stalemate that we have everywhere. The dilemma is that even though it's accurate to describe the last piece of legislation as being flexible as it related to highway transportation, there was another part of it, and that was billions of dollars was borrowed from the Federal Reserve Board to do it. That's not how you do transportation. And Scott Bosworth will tell you that the guy he worked for was a pro. And Bud Schuster. And at that time, boy, John Olver was on the Transportation Subcommittee. We worked as a nation on infrastructure. And people, those infrastructure bills that passed the House, they came out of there with 415 votes out of 435. I mean, members figured out what was in, and then you broke the other guy or woman's wrist trying to get your card in to say yes. And even this now, infrastructure has become a bit of a battle. I was giving a tutorial, as people who work for me hate to listen to, but I mean, Henry Clay made his career on improvements. The Whig Party, and Abraham Lincoln was a devotee of Henry Clay. And, I mean, Dwight Eisenhower saw the need to build a first-class highway system, but he had 2 willing partners, the majority leader, Democrat Lyndon Johnson, and the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, and they did it. You know, when Paul Mark was talking about the challenges, I'm trying to figure out how you get notified of legislative sessions. But I remember when Route 5 was the Northern Pass, before the federal highway was constructed, as it came up through Hartford, and the mistakes that were made in places like Hartford as it came up with 2 lanes in some of those places. Then we moved to 3 lanes, opening it all up. And I think that these kinds of investments where people get a chance to move from point A to point B with greater efficiency increases productivity. And I look at now our streets, the roadways, bridges, airports, water and sewer systems. I mean, for all of us, we understand that there's got to be that regular investment in upkeep. And I think so when you're talking to colleagues, Republican or Democrat, on this, let's get back to the national principle that we all pull the wagon. So I'm delighted you took the time to be with us today. And if you want to send on some of these priorities to me, I'm going to start to talk with the Department of Transportation at the federal level, the administration, the leadership, and certainly I'll pass those on. And do you want to wrap it up, Scott? You
Sure,
were asked
I'll
to-
wrap it up. Just one quick response here. We have two things going on. We have the current act that we live under, which is called FAST Act, and that is an 80-20 program. The program the president keeps talking about is separate from that. So far, so good. They're keeping it separate from that. And yes, that is an 80-20, but the other way around. They're looking for 20%. They want to be the last money in. Governor Baker, last Friday, a week ago today, was at the White House meeting with DJ Gribbins, the president's infrastructure advisor, and told him that that does not work. States will not be able to take advantage of it. It does not work. That is something that you could not do overnight. So, you know, we're very cognizant of the concern there. We respect and appreciate the federal program. Certainly, we're adaptable, but that is just too drastic. So I did want to mention one thing, and I don't want to take too much time, but for those of you who represent Pittsfield, I've had a very, very enjoyable experience working with Unistress and Perry Patrica. And I highlight it because Mr. Patrica came to us as a businessman, as an employer in Pittsfield, and said, you know, your regulations, your state regulations, and the things I have to deal with, everything from weight limits to size limits to police patrols, is killing me. I am not competitive against my neighbors. And so he opened our eyes, and certainly the advent of all electronic tolling has helped too, but he opened our eyes to how we were not, you know, we hadn't updated, we hadn't thought through, we hadn't really gone through our regulations. And I'm happy to say, last week, through his initiative and our work, we completely redid the regulations for overweight, oversized, and, you know, specialty deliveries. And, you know, it's employers like that. They come to us, they tell us the problem, we'll work hard to you know, to fix it. So he was a complete gentleman throughout the entire process. And
he said great things about you and the secretary as well. So I'm glad to hear this is happening. Thank you.
And I'll just close on that note, because the primary complaint as it relates to construction from organized labor is the length of the permitting process now, and what it does to add dollars to the costs. So I think we all have a vested interest in figuring out through smart growth how we might streamline the process, but the permitting process now adds exponentially to the overall cost, which means less money to repair some of the bridges in smaller communities. So this was terrific, thank you, and delighted you all found time on a Friday to participate.
thank you.
That was nice.